Hello, this is Christopher Keene with the American Geosciences Institute. Very pleased everyone is able to join us for this first webinar for the AGU Heads and Chairs community. We are starting this up as part of our collaboration, in support of the departments and in giving us an opportunity to basically have the heads and chairs meet more frequently, even if it is virtually. So I would like to also note a few of our my colleagues here. Pranoti Asher, who's Manager of Education and Public Outreach at AGU, is also online, and she will be making a few comments in a moment, as well as Heather Holton here at AGI, who will be giving us a brief presentation on some of the work that she's done, related to student pathways and how that might feed into the issues of student recruitment and retention in the geosciences. So, excuse me, I would like to spend just a moment to give a few ground rules related to the webinars, things that we have found at AGI that have tended to work fairly well. First of all, during the course of the presentation, everyone will be muted, except obviously the presenter. This just helps making sure that there's no feedback issues during the presentation. Please, during the course of the presentation, if you have questions, use the questions panel that's on your control panel to enter them. And then what I will do is basically moderate those. And then when the presentation is over. After that, and we've moderated the questions that were typed in, then we will make it an open floor, and there is a hand icon that is available on your control panel, and that will raise your hand, and that will let us know to unmute you. And as long as we don't have any feedback from your place, which completely depends on the audio situation that you have on your computer, we will probably keep you unmuted so that there can be ongoing discussion related to the presentation, as well as some items that I know Pranoti and the folks at AGU would like to participate in. So without further ado, I'm going to do a couple things here quickly. I'm going to ask Pranoti to go ahead and make her comments at this point, and I will be back after the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pranoti Asher from AGU. Welcome. We're so pleased that you're able to be part of this new joint effort, this new venture between AGI and AGU. Both organizations, as Chris just mentioned a few minutes ago, have a mutual interest in supporting geoscience and earth and space science departments. We think that this webinar, as well as the entire series that you're seeing on the screen in front of you, is such a great opportunity for us to combine our resources and our activities to strengthen the support for departments and department chairs as well. And as Chris also mentioned, it's an opportunity for heads and chairs to dialogue and discuss issues that are very important to them. So we look forward to your participation, not only today, but also throughout the fall semester. Take a look at the schedule, which will formally begin in the fall semester in September with the topic of student recruiting. Joining the webinar today are not only heads and chairs from AGU, but also heads and chairs from AGI's Directory of Geoscience Departments. We have a pretty broad representation, not only in the types of institutions, but also in the departments as well as in the different regions around the country. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Heather Holton, who is the Education and Outreach Specialist in the Workforce Program at the American Geosciences Institute. Heather has very graciously agreed to share her work from her master's thesis at Purdue University with us today. She is working on developing a framework to use as a mechanism to help departments and professionals like yourself with recruiting and retaining the next generation of geoscientists. Without further ado, here's Heather Holton.
Well, thank you, Pranoti, for that lovely introduction. Again, my name is Heather Holton, and I am with AGI's Workforce Program. Now, prior to this webinar, we asked that you fill out a survey about the reasons why you decided to become a geoscientist, and these questions were based off the results from my master's research. and I investigated why students decide to pursue the geoscience major. Now I'm going to go through some of the key findings of my research, and that will provide you with some background information, and then I'll go ahead and briefly discuss some of the results from your survey. This pathway model really aims to provide you some context about recruitment and retention strategies, and this will be the focus of future discussions in our webinar series. So first, there are limited concrete data on why students decide to major in the geosciences. There's mostly anecdotal evidence that's floating around there, but this issue of recruitment and retention has become increasingly important because about 50% of the current geoscience workforce is expected to retire within the next 5 to 10 years. Now this is equivalent to about 130,000 geoscientists. On top of that, we expect that there's going to be a 23% increase in the number of new jobs available within the same time frame, and that's equivalent to over 60,000 new jobs. Now, if we hire at both the bachelor's level and at the graduate levels for master's and PhD students, we will still have a deficit of 150 geoscientists. So you can see here, just by these statistics alone, that this is going to be a very important topic. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my work, and I titled it Geoscience Academic Provenance. So what is this? Basically what I did is I took students' interests, their experiences, their goals, and future aspirations, and I mapped them temporally, and that allowed me to form a pathway. Now, this is important because there are very many different entry points into the geoscience major. As you may have heard, the pipeline model, you're probably very familiar with that. However, it has a drawback. It has one entry point, and it has been used along with a lot of other recruitment and retention studies. For example, Levine in 2007 used the pipeline model along with the critical incident theory, and basically he tried to understand why geoscience professionals got into the discipline. Now you're probably asking, well, what are critical incidents? These are very specific events that people have experienced that help them make a decision. Now, one drawback about the pipeline model is that it can really only list critical incidents, and it doesn't really find the relationships between different components. However, my pathway model takes these different components, and it is able to determine patterns between them. So from these analyses, I was able to find 6 very distinct pathway steps. And if you did participate in the survey that we emailed out to everyone, you may recognize some of these steps from that survey. So the first pathway step is called the innate attributes and interest sources. So basically these are people's general interests, their personality traits, or different activities that you may pursue because of these interests. There's something fundamentally about yourself of why you're interested in geoscience. The second pathway step are the pre-college critical incidents. So these are those very influential experiences that happened to you prior to college or before you were formally studying geoscience. The next pathway step are the college critical incidents. So these are those events that happened to you during college or during graduate school while you were formally studying geoscience. And then the current or near future goals, these are those goals that you're aspiring towards and trying to accomplish within a short time frame, like 1 to 2 years. The expected career attributes are those attributes that you think a geoscience career will have, what you hope it will be like. And then finally are the actual desired career choices. You know, what do you really want to be as a geoscientist? Now for this population group, I added in an extra pathway step, and it is called the alternate career pathway step. And I did this because since you're further along in your careers, there are some individuals who may have had a different career prior to being a geoscientist. And so I wanted to learn about those. Well, what were you doing before you were a geoscientist, and what made you switch into the geosciences? Within our heads and chairs population, I actually found that only 4 people were alternate careers, and they had differences before they switched into the geosciences, and they were actually all along in the STEM community. So I think one was a chemist, there was a biologist, and engineers. So now I'm going to talk to you about the different types of critical incidents. First, critical incidents can act on behavior in two ways, either as supporting critical incidents or as behavioral altering critical incidents. Supporting critical incidents basically are those experiences that have reinforced your decision, whereas behavioral altering critical incidents helped catalyze a decision. It helped really make that decision for you. Now, from my previous studies, I found that there were 4 distinct population groups. The first are geoscience natives. These are the students who started the geoscience major like at the very beginning of college. Either they made that decision before they got into college or as they enrolled into college. So they're basically native to the major. The immigrants are students who switched into the major from a previous discipline. Refugees are students who chose the geoscience major, but only because it was like a last resort. It was for a means to an end, and they didn't really intend on pursuing it in the future. And finally, emigrants are students who dropped the geoscience major, so they left the discipline altogether. So here for this presentation, I'm going to concentrate only on the natives and the immigrants pathways because they exhibit a much more robust pathway for each of them. So here's an example of how the pathways actually look. Now, if you follow my mouse, we can start here. This is the first pathway step of the innate attributes and interest sources. And this acts as the foundation of the pathway. And if you follow the pathway up, here, these are elements of the past. So we have your innate attributes and interest sources, your pre-college critical incidents, and then elements of the present here are the critical incidents students experience during college and their current goals that they're aiming towards. And then the future time steps are their expected career attributes and the actual careers that they're trying to pursue. So in the next slide, I'm actually going to compare and contrast these two specific pathways. So first, let's look at the differences between them. You may see here that the first difference is this entry point. You can tell that natives enter into the major before the immigrants do because they enter in right after their pre-college critical incidents. Now, looking here with this geo ability here and here, you can see that both populations have this very high sense of self-efficacy that they can really succeed in geoscience. It's this confirmation of geoscience ability. But as you can see, it's not until college that the immigrants experience this. Now, for most immigrants, a lot of people had a previous major that they didn't like, and so something about that major made them want to decide to major in the geosciences instead. And so that is one specific telling point that is different for immigrants and natives because only immigrants can really have a previous major that led them into the geosciences. Now looking at the future time steps, you can see that there's a divergence in their pathways. First, looking at the natives, you see that their expected career attributes, they really just want to make money. A lot of students indicated to me that they're looking to make money and they hope to get careers where they can take care of their families. And that is pretty consistent with what the types of careers they're pursuing, which are very industry-based, government, oil, mining, etc. Whereas if you look at the immigrants here, they have more altruistic attributes. They want to make global impacts. They want to share their knowledge with students and stay in school. And actually, this is pretty consistent with the types of careers that they're pursuing. Their careers are very academic and research-based. Now, looking at the similarities between population sets, we see this concept of epiphany right here. And the geoscience epiphany is really the aha moment that students experience. A lot of times it has to do with the scale of the Earth and truly how big it is, or the concept of deep time in geoscience. And so students have these realizations and they become interested in geology and geoscience, and so it continues them on their geoscience pathway. Now notice here that they have expected career attributes and they have several things in common. Field work, they hope that geoscience will open career opportunities for them, they'll have job security, etc. But even though they have these expected career attributes in common, they actually didn't have any desired careers in common at all. Their two pathways remained divergent. So now what I'd like to do is quickly go through the Heads and Chairs survey and look at those two different pathways and find the similarities and differences between those. So first, I got about 21 responses overall in the survey that I could use. 10 of the responses from your survey were categorized as natives, so those were individuals who decided to major in the geosciences right off the bat. 7 were immigrants, so they switched into the major, and then 4, like I said before, were the alternate career pathways. Now for the innate attributes and interest sources here, we see that the natives have more of a geoscience awareness. And this started at a pretty young age. So in general, natives have the sense of, wow, they look outside and they actually understand, or they see how what they see is related to the geosciences. They're aware of their surroundings. And this may go hand in hand with their curiosity, which is here. And these two things were very different than when I looked at the immigrants, because the immigrants didn't really have those two things, and their interests were a little bit more broad. They had general interests here, and they spanned different STEM disciplines, and they also had these items here: creativity, museums, and early exposure. Looking at the pre-college critical incidents for the natives, we see that before they started college, these natives actually got information on geoscience careers. So that may have helped them make that decision to major in the geosciences at the start of college. The immigrants didn't receive this information until after they were in college, so I thought that that was a pretty interesting difference. And of course, with the immigrants, they had a previous major that induced a behavioral change. These are those previous majors that they didn't like, and they ended up switching into the geosciences. Now looking at this sense of geoscience ability, it's that self-efficacy. The immigrants didn't get that sense of self-efficacy until after college, which makes sense because they weren't really pursuing it until then. And for natives, the most important college critical incidents were these really hands-on experiences. A lot of you had research experiences where you thought, hey, I can do this. This is great. It was really interesting to you. And in addition to that, you had great positive experiences with field camp. And the immigrants didn't really have that at all. So looking at the goals here, we see that the immigrants had quite an emphasis on recruitment and retention. And this actually makes sense because if you think about it, they were the ones who switched into the major a little bit later. So perhaps they're looking at themselves thinking, well, what made me switch in? Maybe I should focus on those things. And these are the roles and the goals that they're thinking of as a department head and chair. Now looking in the future time step here with the expected career attributes, we see that natives are really interested in the integration of different techniques. This included integrating technology, in what they do, whether it was in their research, in the classroom, or even developing online courses. I thought that was pretty interesting. And they also said that they have the opportunity to really work with different types of people. This spanned developing relationships between different departments and within the community, and networking, and also being able to work well with different types of personalities. And finally, we see at the last desired career choices, this last pathway step, really the immigrants didn't have too many focused career choices, and this makes sense because you guys are much further along in your careers. However, the natives cited this administrative reason. They have aspirations of going into higher administrative, like being a dean, etc. So looking at the similarities, we see that there are a lot of comparable interests. These are things that probably won't surprise you. A lot of people mentioned that they love the outdoors and they like to spend time outdoors. A lot of you said that you're very good at problem solving, or that you like to do problem solving things as children. One interesting point here is this history and geoscience time. There's a lot of interest in general history, and a lot of people connected that with, oh, well, I always liked history, and now I like geoscience because I get to look at deep earth time. And so I thought that was an interesting thing to note. If we look here at the critical incidents, both of these pathway steps, we see that mentors and personal influences are extremely important. This family or friend influence happened to be a critical incident in both population sets, and it was really important because out of these data represent about 17 of respondents, and 11 of those cited something about having a family or a friend influence that helped them get into the geosciences. Now, looking at the college critical incidents, again, mentors and advisors played a huge role, as well as their faculty influences. Looking at the very end here, we see that a lot of you actually do enjoy being a head and chair, and you think that that is a very high point in your career, which I think is great. Now, I want to emphasize that this theoretical framework really goes beyond the pipeline model, and it's the first to fully map out these geoscience pathways into and out of the major. And because we do this academic provenance analysis between the different groups of people, like the natives versus the immigrants, we can actually determine if there are any interesting patterns between their pathways, as you can see, because I was able to do that with your survey results. And I think that professionals really from all geoscience sectors could potentially use this as a tool to inform their recruitment and retention efforts and tailor them to specific population groups. So I hope that this can become especially important regarding the student to professional transition into the workforce, since there are going to be so many job opportunities in the future. So right now I would like to open the floor to all of you for any questions that you may have. And as Chris said earlier, there's a chat box on the bottom part of your GoToWebinar screen, or you can also raise your hand if you have any questions for me.
Thank you, Heather. Well, folks ponder some questions if they have any additional ones. Got a couple that came in for you. So I guess first question is, how would you compare and contrast what the kind of results that you see from the Heads and Chairs survey, which obviously are folks that did move into the profession for the long term, compared to what you're seeing as far as the students, and what that might shed some light on as far as is there a certain strength in certain pathways in essence?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, there's a generational difference, definitely. Many of the natives who talked about actually learning about careers early on in their pre-college critical incidents, they said that they gained this information on careers in the early 80s, which was right before the oil boom. And so I thought that that was an interesting perspective. And actually, one other key difference I found was this whole family influence back here, this friend or family influence in the heads and chairs. It was not nearly as important in my original study. So I don't know if that's because, and again, because of the generational issue or not, but I thought it was very interesting that friend and family influence was highly important here, whereas for my participants who are, undergraduates now, it didn't play much of a role.
Okay. Another question that just came in. So working with a survey like this and what you're seeing as far as these complex pathways, what is in your sense ideally the number of responses you really would want to start having to really build a substantial level of confidence in the analysis?
Well, it's interesting because originally, in my original study, I had 17 participants, but my method of collecting data was very different. I did very in-depth interviews, and those interviews took anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half. And so within those interviews, I got a lot of very detailed, in-depth data. And so I could tease out a lot of that. Now, if I'm going to implement this on a larger scale, clearly I wouldn't be able to conduct those in-depth interviews. And so I'm currently trying to develop a way to facilitate that and to make it into a useful tool for professionals to actually use and see if they can collect data on their own. But I'm not to that point yet, because if you did take that survey, a lot of those questions, I'm asking you, what was one specific experience? And I'm hoping you give me what I'm asking, but I'm trying to probe deeper. So I'm still working on developing that idea. But in general, I would say a larger population set would be great, but it's really about the in-depth data rather than how many people you have.
Okay. So another question is, though you've restricted your comments here, really looking at natives and immigrants. One person's asking, can you describe briefly what percentage of majors that you would describe as refugees? What do you think you would be seeing here?
Right. In my original study, out of the 17 participants, I only had one refugee. And that's a good thing because we don't want to be recruiting a whole bunch of students who don't want to do anything with the major after they graduate, right? So I would say the refugees are a very, very small percentage. And actually, when I did a follow-up study, I found that there was one person who was an immigrant, one person who dropped the geoscience major. And I found some very interesting information from him as well on his thought process and why he decided to drop the major. One of those reasons was because he didn't think that he could be employed as a geoscientist. He didn't really know of any jobs he could do as a geoscientist, which is terrible considering how many jobs you're going to have available. And the second thing is he thought that really to be a geoscientist you would have to live in places like Colorado or Alaska. And I don't know where that came from. So I think he had a little bit of misinformation.
Okay.
But that kind of gives you some breakdown of my population groups.
Sure. Three questions that sort of I think can be combined in. Can you talk about, particularly in that original survey dealing with the students, sort of the regional dependency on the responses, and how you would view the regional differences? What would your expectations be, for schools down in the oil patch versus, say, in the Northeast or Northwest or something like that?
Right, exactly. And I didn't mention my demographics for brevity, but my participants were either from Indiana University or from Purdue University, and that clearly has a very specific demographic. All students were Caucasian, with the exception of 2 who listed themselves as other, but as I interviewed them, they were pretty much Caucasian. I had, I think, 5 girls, but looking at them, their pathways were pretty specific to their views on life. So I'm interested to see, I would expect to see a lot of differences. And that's why I don't expect people to use this model to say, oh, well, you know, up here in the Midwest, they saw that natives only wanted industry and immigrants only wanted academia, and now I'm seeing something different, so it must be wrong. That's not the purpose of the model. The purpose is to use it to see how things differ, and I definitely expect them to see, well, if you're in Texas, I would expect to see that a lot of people probably come in with the knowledge of, well, I could go into the oil industry because it's all around them. They're exposed to that type of information early on. Whereas maybe if they're in California, for example, maybe they know a lot more about earthquakes, and that's what gets them involved. So it would definitely highly depend on region, and you know, even diversity demographics as well. You never know. But I would like to get to that point where we could use this model to investigate those areas further.
Okay. Another question, which I really think gets to the crux of the matter, you know, if you were a chair, how would you use these results? How would you use these models to actually affect the recruitment and retention of students in your department?
That's a great question. Well, what I would do, it would really depend on what type of students you're trying to recruit and retain. If, say, you are a chair down in Texas again, and you know that they want people to go into the extraction industry or into exploration, you may want to look at, okay, well, what are some of these specific experiences that students had as natives that led them to want to go into the oil industry? So you could take that information and say, okay, well, a lot of them knew about the geoscience career. A lot of them want to make money or have lucrative careers, and you can take that information and help students say, okay, listen, you are a geoscience native, for example. You've had these different experiences in college. You've loved to do field work. You were great at it. You score really high in your tests. You have a good sense of geoscience ability, right? So maybe you could take that information and guide them into the types of careers that you think that they would be well suited for. You know, lots of problem solving, lots of mapping, potentially lots of outdoor work, because you know just through their experiences and their interests that they may be more inclined to pursue industry-based careers, say in the oil and gas sector. So really it's about looking at the very specific pathways of your population and seeing, okay, well, maybe they had amazing field trip experiences. Maybe we should focus our courses to have more field trip experiences and have them work a lot more hands-on and see if that'll catalyze more interest, just for an example.
So, you know, I think, you know, looking at your previous study with the natives and the immigrants, where, you know, particularly from a retention standpoint, I mean, the way it sort of boiled down was the immigrants actually, shall we say, were more driven by the intellectual curiosity that that the educational environment really nurtures, where a lot of the natives, shall we say, were more interested in getting out the back end and moving on, which, you know, obviously that's a tougher retention. I mean, if it's an end goal and not an ongoing experience of what they're really seeking, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how the model could be used in making sure that you keep the natives who come in interested remain interested, because they seem to actually be outside of their ideal environment, in that sense, their long-term target environment?
Right, yeah, I see that. Well, keep in mind, natives, what makes them a native is the fact that they wanted to be a geoscientist early on. So I actually think that it's probably more likely that you would retain your natives because they've made this decision early on. Yes, they do have a future goal in mind to get out of academia and go into industry, but I think, at least from my experiences in my interviews, they liked their classes. They wanted to stay, and once they really got those hands-on experiences, they're like, yeah, I know I'm going to have a job. So I didn't really have any fear of losing the natives. The immigrants, they all had a different type of passion. So a lot of my natives said, yeah, there's an endpoint. I'm going to get through this schooling. I'll go to grad school if I have to, just so I can get that job. Like, they're here to do that job. Whereas the immigrants, since they switched in, it's almost like a newfound passion for them. You know, they may have been burned out on engineering, for example, but once they found geoscience, they like love it. So I found that interesting because immigrants were almost more passionate about the general study of geoscience because they were enthralled with the idea, and they didn't really need to see the endpoint because they were so excited about the topic itself. So retaining students, whether they're a native or an immigrant, I don't think necessarily is the point. I think it's really looking at those immigrants. Well, what if someone is wavering? What if someone is like, I don't know, what do I do? And that was with that one example I said earlier about that student who talked about, well, I can't be a geoscientist unless if I live in Colorado or Alaska. Like, where did you get that perception? So it's really about talking to your students early on in their freshman and sophomore classes, perhaps, about the opportunities that exist to them and really about the realities of what it is to be a geoscientist, and make sure they don't walk away having incorrect information.
Okay. Another question that's come in, has this kind of analysis been done in other disciplines and fields, and if so, what are the similarities and differences?
Actually, I haven't specifically looked into that. I know that it would be very applicable, but I haven't seen other people map out the pathways that I have. It may be out there, but I haven't really seen it prominently in the community, in the science community, education community. But that's something to look into further, obviously. I'm hoping that this framework can, I mean, the idea can definitely span across STEM disciplines very easily. I just haven't come across very much literature on the topic.
Okay. Another question is, anecdotally, most people I know assume that a large part of what attracts college students to the geosciences are field trips and field work. And the question is, based on your work, is this a valid assumption, or are we starting to face a generational difference?
Yeah, actually, that did come up a lot in my interviews. A lot of students, let me see if I can move back the slide. Here we go. So here you can see in the similarities, actually. This is from my original study. A lot of students, you know, they had a geoscience awareness. They love to be outdoors. Outdoors was a huge thing, especially for immigrants here, this outdoors. And rock collection was a common one, which clearly you have to be outdoors. But field work, that was with all populations. A lot of kids, they get in because they love the field trips, they love the field work. And look here in their college critical incidents, what's interesting is in college, it's this geoscience course or lab, it's those field trip experiences here that prove to be very important. If you look up to the immigrants, you see that for the natives, I'm sorry, this teacher and professor influence was very important for natives because they had someone to support them before they got into college. It was an actual person, but the courses didn't matter much, which is interesting. It wasn't until here, the field trips and the field work in college, that really got people interested here. And let's see, yeah, the field courses. So I would say that that's a pretty good assumption. Still, I don't think it's generational. Okay,
sounds good. That's a lot of great questions. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or type them in. We can unmute you if you want to ask Heather something specific before we hand it back over to Pranoti. Give folks about 15 seconds. Okay. I guess, Heather, that was a lot of information. I think a lot of really, really good questions. And I think what I'll do now is hand this back over to Pranoti. I know she has a number of things that she wants to discuss.
Okay, thank you, Heather. That was very exciting to hear all these questions and such engagement from all the participants. Thank you. So as you can see, I'm interested in asking you 3 specific questions, and I hope that many of you will respond with the same enthusiasm that you just did to Heather's presentation. So once again, to remind you, to talk, make sure you click the raise your hand button, and I think Chris will unmute you to listen to your comment. And so I would really appreciate your response to these 3 questions that you see on the screen. First of all, what are your reactions to this particular presentation, and what do you think about having this monthly webinar series starting in September? And is this webinar series valuable to you? Please make sure that once you are getting ready to talk, once you have the opportunity to talk, that you state your name prior to your comment. So I think Chris will unmute all the attendees. If you have a question, I guess you have. Once he sees that you have a question, he will unmute you.
Okay. I mean, we can also just open it up. I mean, I can try to unmute everybody if you'd like. So we're trying to.
Okay.
So basically, I've unmuted the maximum number of folks. So, does anyone have any specific feedback here regarding the idea of the monthly webinar series and an opportunity for discussion among chairs on various topics and looking for input on those potential topics into the future?
Yes, John.
Go ahead, John. You're unmuted. Okay. Susan, we have you unmuted. You seem to...
Well, I'm just laughing. Chairs are not usually this shy. Well, no, I just, did you want us to speak our
Sure.
questions and feedback, or to type them in? I was planning to type in a bunch of feedback later, I guess.
Well, I think you know, most everyone seems to have pretty good audio without feedback, so I mean, we might be able to get a conversation going also among your colleagues too here. So I think go ahead and let us know.
Well, I think that's a great series. I'm actually in my 6th and final year as chair, so if I can, I'll still look at the, you know, participate, but I won't be chair more than 2 more months. So I'm sorry that it wasn't available a few years ago, so I think it will be useful to the people who are chairs. I look forward to them.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. This is Pranoti Asher. Once you're not the chair, maybe you can pass on the messages from AGI or AGU to your new chair, and perhaps when you get time, you could still take a peek every once in a while. I think that would be lovely.
I plan to.
What do you think would be, you know, pertinent topics, particularly for something where, you know, say like a 15 or 20-minute presentation, maybe that can generate a conversation? I mean, do you have some suggestions?
I'd have to think about it. I mean, I looked at your list of topics. I thought they were useful.
Yeah.
Are there more people unmuted, or is it just me?
No, there's I'm able to get most everyone unmuted. There's just a couple people where we were getting feedback. So
okay. No, I think I mean, some of the questions that we have would be difficult, I think, to do in a webinar. I think they are dealt with in the meetings at AGU, which are good, which are great, actually. So this is sort of an extension of those meetings, which I haven't been able to go to the last couple of years. But, you know, for us, it feels like geoscience is sort of a moving target as a field. And so that would be interesting to me, is to have a general discussion about whether there's sort of a core sensibility to being a geoscientist and sort of the direction that different units are moving.
Check 1 2.
Oh.
Check 1 2 3.
we got someone there.
We hear you.
Oh, okay. I was just testing my audio. Sorry to butt in like that, but just an overall comment. I'm going to be a new chair starting in August, so I would find these useful just to sort of bounce ideas off folks, but mostly as information gathering at this point. So I'll be a participant if you do it in the fall.
Very good.
Now the other side of this is, you know, our intention is that we're recording this webinar, and it will be available, you know, for later viewing, whether for your own reference or if, you know, schedule-wise you're unable to attend, you know, or you can point your colleagues to it. So I mean, yeah, you know, that idea of this being sort of an information opportunity, I think, is key. And I think one of my hopes, and I don't know, I think you would concur, Pranoti, is, you know, is that hopefully that there are some very clear topics and passions by some of the chairs that would actually want to try to lead some of these conversations and maybe provide sort of a stimulating presentation on an issue in their department or whatever that might be able to generate that conversation, or just even as a problem set to, you know, for people to get feedback on.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, Chris. I think that's a great idea. We've lined up the series for the fall just as to, you know, to get people used to this and get them, you know, the regulars and maybe the folks who cannot make it to the fall meeting to sort of try and have some interaction with their colleagues, you know, who are possibly facing the same things in their department. So you could do this over email, or you can send this as a question. If you think of other topics or a particular issue in your department that is sort of troubling to you, or something that you need feedback from other chairs, I think would make a fabulous topic for a future webinar.
Okay.
This is Susan again, University of Delaware. I do have a comment, which is that in other webinars that I've been in, which has been a different system, you've actually been able to see who the other participants are. And maybe there's a button that I haven't pushed, but I think it might help with the discussion side if people actually kind of knew who else was there. Ah, there it is.
There it is. Sorry, my fault.
You know, and you know, hopefully the numbers will grow as people know about it and you know, have a chance to talk to other people about it as well.
Yeah.
And if you have networks in your own area or region or state where, you know, you converse with other department chairs, please feel free to forward the messages that you either get from Chris or myself, you know, about these webinars and also about the fall meeting Heads and Chairs workshop.
Okay.
So I guess with that, any other last comments?
I'll do a little wrap-up. I think we have one more slide, Chris.
Okay.
So just again, if you have any additional questions or comments or topics that you would like as a future webinar, please feel free to contact me at my AGU email. And if you have any specific questions for Heather about her work, about the pathway models, please contact her directly at the email address that you see on the screen. Thank you so very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your continued participation in the fall. And I hope you all have a very great summer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pranoti.
Thank you.